3 entire Roman legions vanished without a trace. This is the mystery of the Lost Legion of Varus, a catastrophe that shattered Rome's northern frontier and left an empire in mourning. By the end of this story, you will understand exactly how a trusted insider engineered the perfect trap and how modern detectives finally found its gruesome proof. We will walk the same forest paths where 20,000 soldiers disappeared and uncover why their very names were erased from history. What does it take for a civilization to truly forget a defeat? The key to this catastrophe lies in the man Rome chose to govern its newest frontier. Publius Quinctilius Varus was not a hardened legionary commander forged in fire. He was first and foremost an administrator. His career was built in the marble halls of politics and provincial governance. He had married into the imperial family, becoming the husband of a great niece of Emperor Augustus himself. This connection placed him firmly within the trusted inner circle of Rome's first citizen. His most notable previous assignment was as the governor of Syria, a wealthy and largely pacified eastern province. There, his reputation was built on implementing Roman law, collecting taxes with a heavy hand, and pushing the process of Romanization. He was the perfect man to bring civilized order to a settled territory. And that is precisely why Emperor Augustus sent him to Germania. The official war was over. The great Germanic campaigns of Drusus and Tiberius had, in the eyes of Rome, successfully conquered the lands between the Rhine and the Elbe rivers. This vast territory was now the new province of Germania. Varus was not dispatched to fight a war, but to build a province. His mission was to introduce Roman courts, Roman census, and Roman taxation. He was to turn fierce warriors into compliant taxpayers, to transform tribal chieftains into municipal magistrates. He brought with him 3 legions, not as an invasion force, but as a garrison, a symbol of Roman authority, and the muscle needed to enforce his bureaucratic decrees. It was a monumental task of integration, and Varus approached it with the confidence of a man who believed the hard work had already been done. He saw the Germanic tribes not as a latent army, but as subjects in need of proper administration. This fundamental misunderstanding would become the foundation of the trap. But into this scene of administrative ambition walked a man who understood both sides perfectly. His name was Arminius, a prince of the Cherusci tribe. As a young boy, he had been sent to Rome as a political hostage, a common practice to ensure the loyalty of conquered peoples. Yet Rome did not simply imprison these young nobles. It educated them, Romanized them, and often turned them into its most effective tools. Arminius was the ultimate success story of this system. He was raised in the heart of the empire, learned Latin, studied Roman military tactics, and was granted the ultimate honor of Roman citizenship. He didn't just serve in the army, he excelled, rising to the rank of X, a knight commanding auxiliary cavalry units. To Varus and his staff, Arminius was the ideal model of the new Germanic citizen. He was fluent in their ways, loyal to Rome, and a trusted advisor on local affairs. He wore the uniform, spoke the language, and understood the bureaucracy. He was, for all intents and purposes, a Roman officer, but beneath that polished exterior, a different loyalty had never died. Arminius lived in a state of profound duality. In Rome, he was always the Germanic outsider, no matter his rank. Back among the Cherusci, his Roman education and mannerisms might mark him as an alien. He occupied a lonely middle ground, a man without a true home, until he made a conscious and devastating choice. He chose his blood, he chose his people. And he realized his unique position gave him the perfect weapon, the complete trust of the Roman governor. With that trust, he began to weave a conspiracy of breathtaking audacity. He would not lead a frontal rebellion against the legions, a fight his people would surely lose. Instead, he would use Rome's own strength against it. He would lure the entire occupying army, with Varus at its head. deep into unfamiliar territory, into a place where Roman discipline and formation would mean nothing. He planned to liberate his homeland not by meeting the legions on an open field, but by making the very forest itself swallow them whole. And to do that, he first had to give Varus a reason to march. The year was 9 AD, and from the Roman perspective, Germania was a province under construction. Along the great Rhine River, permanent legionary fortresses rose from the earth, their timber walls and orderly streets a stark declaration of permanence. Roads, those iconic arteries of Roman power, began to push tentatively eastward into the dense forests. Trading posts buzzed with activity as Roman merchants exchanged wine, pottery, and metalwork for amber, furs, and slaves. On the surface, the project of civilization was proceeding exactly as planned. Many tribal chieftains, recognizing the undeniable might of Rome, had chosen a path of cooperation. They paid the required tribute, they sent their young men to serve as auxiliary soldiers in the Roman army, and they appeared in Varus's newly established courts to settle their disputes. To Governor Varus, seated in his headquarters, the reports would have been deeply satisfying. The legions were not fighting, they were building and policing. The tribes were complying, Germania was being woven into the fabric of the empire. This was the illusion of peace, a thin veneer over a deep well of bitterness. For the Germanic peoples, this Roman order felt like a slow suffocation. The tribute was not a fair tax, but a heavy extraction of their wealth. Roman officials, often arrogant and dismissive of local customs, dispensed justice that felt foreign and unjust. The very presence of the legions was a constant humiliation, a reminder of their conquered status. Most corrosive of all was the cultural imposition, the silent demand that they abandon the ways of their ancestors for the manners of Rome. This simmering resentment created a fertile ground for conspiracy. Arminius, moving silently between the Roman camps and the tribal gatherings, did not have to invent grievances. He merely had to give them a voice and a direction. He spoke a language the chieftains understood, one of honor, freedom, and blood. One by one, he forged a secret coalition, a sworn brotherhood of tribes who set aside their own ancient rivalries for a single, monumental purpose. Beneath the quiet order of the new province, an army was gathering in the shadows, united not by a king, but by a shared, seething desire to expel the Romans forever. And the man they trusted to lead them was the one the Romans trusted most of all. The routine order to break camp and march west would have been met with a collective sigh of relief. It was late summer in the year 9 AD, and the campaign season was ending. Governor Varus, with his 3 legions, the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th, gave the command to move from their summer operations near the Weser River back to the safety and comfort of their permanent winter fortresses along the Rhine. This was not a maneuver of war, but an administrative relocation, a seasonal migration they had performed before. The column that formed was a moving city, a testament to Roman logistical might and the sheer weight of their presence. At its core were the 15,000 legionaries, the disciplined heart of the force. Surrounding them were an additional 5,000 auxiliary troops, cavalry scouts, and archers drawn from allied tribes. But the army was only part of the story. Trailing behind was a vast, rumbling baggage train. There were the soldiers' personal servants, merchants who supplied the camps, blacksmiths and carpenters, and the families of many officers and long-serving veterans. Wives and children walked alongside carts piled high with tents, tools, personal belongings, and the accumulated comforts of a long summer in the field. In total, nearly 20,000 souls stretched in a vulnerable line that snaked for miles along the narrow forest tracks. The mood was not one of alert tension, but of weary anticipation. The soldiers marched in loose order, their heavy packs and armor a familiar burden on the road home. The sound was not of war drums, but of creaking wagon wheels, the lowing of oxen, and the chatter of civilians. They were not expecting combat because, according to their trusted guide, the land was pacified. and that guide, Arminius, was riding at the head of the column with Varus, offering his usual, invaluable counsel on the best route through the dense, looming Teutoburg Forest. The forest closed in around them, a green tunnel of ancient oaks and tangled undergrowth. It was here, on the third day of their march, that the trap was finally sprung. Arminius, riding alongside Varus, suddenly reined in his horse. He pointed urgently toward a scout galloping from the eastern tree line. The man, breathless and mud-spattered, delivered his report directly to the governor. A small but insolent rebellion had erupted in a distant settlement, a day's hard march to the north. A local chieftain was refusing Roman authority, burning tax records, and rallying a few hundred hot-headed warriors. It was exactly the kind of nuisance Varus had been sent to Germania to stamp out. To the Roman commander, this was not a crisis but an opportunity. Here was a chance to demonstrate the swift, decisive justice of Rome before the rot could spread. He could crush this minor defiance on his way home, reinforcing his authority for the entire province. The report played perfectly to his administrative mindset. It was a problem to be solved, a ledger to be balanced, and crucially, it came from his most reliable source, the man who had never given him reason to doubt, Arminius himself. Without a second thought, Varus made the decision that doomed his army. He ordered the entire column, all 20,000 souls and its miles of baggage, to turn off the established track. They would leave the relative openness of the path and plunge deeper into the unknown woods, taking a shortcut to quell this rebellion. He dismissed the advice of other Germanic allies who warned him the terrain was treacherous and the reports might be exaggerated. To Varus, their caution sounded like the complaints of lazy guides, not the strategic insight of a loyal Roman officer like Arminius. With the governor's command, the massive, sluggish train began its fateful pivot. Wagons were manhandled onto narrow, muddy trails. Soldiers, already tired from days of marching, now had to hack through thick brush to make way for the carts. The orderly column dissolved into a struggling, elongated mess, its cohesion shattered by the dense forest. And as the Romans bogged down in the mud and the gloom, Arminius and his hand-picked cavalrymen asked for permission to ride ahead. They would scout the path, they said, and rally loyal tribes to help suppress the rebels. Varus, pleased with their initiative, granted it immediately. He watched his trusted advisor and his Germanic cavalry vanish into the trees, believing they were securing his victory. He never saw them again, for Arminius was not riding to put down a rebellion. He was riding to join one. He galloped straight to the hidden mustering point where thousands of Germanic warriors from half a dozen tribes stood silent among the trees, their weapons ready, their faces painted for war. The reported rebellion was a complete fiction. The real army was here, waiting in the rain-soaked hills of the Teutoburg Forest, and the Romans were now walking directly into its jaws. The landscape they entered was a meticulously chosen killing ground. This was the Saltus Teutoburgensis, the Teutoburg Forest, and it was a terrain designed by nature to dismantle a Roman legion. Forget the open plains where Rome's war machine was invincible. This was a claustrophobic world of mud, mist, and twisted roots. The only paths were narrow tracks, little more than deer trails, winding between walls of ancient oak and beech. On one side, the ground often fell away into treacherous, waterlogged bogs, pits of sucking mud that could swallow a man and his horse without a trace. On the other side rose steep, wooded ridges, silent and watching. For the Romans, this geography was a tactical prison. Their legendary strength lay in cohesion, in the impenetrable wall of shields and the deadly thrust of organized ranks. Here, there was no room for a battle line. The forest forced the entire army, all 20,000 of them, into a single, painfully thin file that stretched for over 10 miles. The mighty Roman column was no longer a column. It was a snake, a vulnerable string of individuals struggling through the muck. Cavalry, the swift eyes and reaction force of the army, was utterly useless. Horses stumbled on the slippery inclines or sank to their bellies in the hidden marshes. The legionaries, burdened by their heavy armor, shields, and marching packs, could barely maintain their footing, let alone form up for a fight. They were reduced to a slow, struggling mob, and from the ridges above, unseen eyes tracked every labored step. The Germanic warriors, lightly armed and knowing every inch of this land, moved like ghosts through the undergrowth. They did not need to meet the Romans head-on. They simply had to wait to pick their moments and to let the forest do most of the work. The perfect trap was not just the ambush, but the very ground upon which it was sprung. The first attack came not with a war cry, but with the whisper of flying wood. As the rain lashed the struggling column, a sudden hail of javelins and arrows erupted from the tree line. There were no massed ranks of warriors to charge, no clear enemy to engage. Only fleeting shadows between the trunks, the snap of a bowstring, and then another soldier would fall, clutching at a shaft buried in his neck or thigh. The initial Roman reaction was not panic, but profound disorientation. The centurions barked orders, but their commands were swallowed by the howling wind and the screams of the wounded. "Form a battle line," they shouted, but how could they when the path was only 3 men wide and flanked by a bog on one side and a steep slope on the other? The legionaries, trained for open field combat, scrambled in the deepening mud, their heavy shields becoming burdens as they tried to face threats coming from all directions at once. They were not fighting an army, they were being hunted by a forest. The Germanic warriors, masters of this terrain, employed a tactic of devastating simplicity. A small band would materialize from the undergrowth, unleash a volley of spears, and then melt back into the gloom before a counterattack could be organized. They targeted the weakest points, the baggage train at the rear. Carts, bogged down and abandoned, were set ablaze, the fire hissing against the rain and casting monstrous shadows. Panic began to ripple through the civilians, the non-combatants whose presence now became a catastrophic liability. They surged forward, crashing into the ranks of soldiers trying to fight, breaking what little cohesion remained. The march dissolved into a bloody, chaotic scramble. For hours, this nightmare continued. The Romans would beat back one group of attackers, only to be assailed from the opposite flank 100 paces further down the trail. Every step forward was paid for in blood and exhaustion. Somehow, as daylight began to fail, the vanguard of the column fought its way into a slightly more open area, a patch of high ground less choked by immediate forest. It was not a victory, but a momentary respite. With the grim efficiency of a doomed army, the surviving legionaries used their last reserves of strength to do what they were trained to do. They dug. With their short swords and entrenching tools, they carved a makeshift rampart and ditch out of the sodden earth. They formed a defensive perimeter, dragging the few remaining wagons into the line. That night, within this pathetic fortress, there was no rest. The rain continued to fall on 20,000 drenched, shivering, and terrified souls. The moans of the wounded mixed with the sobs of women and children. The crackle of distant Germanic campfires in the woods served as a constant, mocking reminder that the noose was still tight. They had survived the first day, but the confidence of the Roman governor was gone, replaced by a cold, hard truth. This was no police action against a minor rebellion. This was a meticulously planned annihilation, and they were trapped at its center. The question hanging in the damp air was no longer about when they would reach the Rhine, but if any of them would see another sunset. Dawn on the second day brought no relief, only a deeper, more profound horror. The makeshift camp was a scene of carnage and exhaustion, but to stay was to die. Varus gave the only order left. They would abandon their pathetic fortifications and force a march through the forest, hoping against hope to reach open ground. It was a decision born of desperation, and it turned the second day into a slow, grinding massacre. As the battered column stumbled back onto the trail, the Germanic attacks transformed. The sporadic harassment of the first day was over. Now the warriors struck with terrifying coordination and ferocity. They no longer just hid in the trees. They came charging down the steep slopes in organized bands, their faces painted for war, their screams echoing through the mist. They had studied the Roman army for years, and they knew exactly where to strike its heart. They targeted the centurions, the veteran backbone of the legions, distinguished by their transverse crests. They hunted the aquilifers, the sacred standard-bearers who carried the legion's eagle, the very soul of the unit. Each time an eagle standard wobbled and fell, a piece of the army's spirit died with it. The chaos was absolute. The narrow path became a river of churned mud and blood. Roman discipline, the legendary glue that held the legions together, dissolved completely. Soldiers no longer fought as units, they fought as terrified individuals, slipping and falling over the bodies of their comrades. The baggage train, once a symbol of Roman comfort, became a rolling death trap. Carts were overturned and plundered, their contents scattered. The non-combatants, the merchants, the servants, the families, had nowhere to run. The Germanic warriors showed no quarter. The slaughter was indiscriminate and brutal, the screams of women and children adding a new, horrific layer to the din of battle. By the time the failing light forced another miserable halt, the Roman army was no longer an army. It was a shattered, bleeding remnant. They had gained almost no ground. Their supplies were gone, plundered or abandoned in the mud. The wounded who could not keep up had been left behind to their fate, and the forest around them, now utterly silent, felt more like a tomb than ever. They were not just surrounded, they were being consumed piece by the land itself. The third dawn broke over a landscape of utter ruin. What remained of the three legions was a haggard, terrified mob, perhaps a few thousand strong, surrounded by the silent, watching forest. Their only hope was a low hill they could see in the distance, a place we now call Kalkriese. It was not a fortress, just a slight rise in the terrain, a patch of marginally higher ground in the sea of bog and trees. With their last shreds of strength and discipline, they fought their way toward it, a final, desperate scramble for a defensible position. They reached the slope and turned, forming a ragged perimeter with their backs to the hill. There would be no more marching. This was the end of the line. The Germanic warriors, sensing the kill, emerged from the trees not in scattered bands but in a vast encircling host. They had been herding the Romans toward this exact spot for 2 days. Now, with the advantage of the higher ground stripped from their prey, they closed in for the final act. The air filled with the roar of thousands of voices, a sound that drowned out the rain and the wind. The final assault was not an ambush but a deliberate, crushing annihilation. The thin Roman line buckled and then shattered under the weight of the charge. There was no elegant tactics, no orderly retreat. It was a brutal, close-quarters slaughter on a muddy hillside. In the midst of this chaos, the command structure dissolved. Governor Varus, wounded and seeing the eagles of his legions toppled into the muck, understood the totality of the catastrophe. Capture by the tribesmen meant a fate far worse than death, likely ritual sacrifice or humiliating slavery. Following the ultimate Roman code of honor for a defeated commander, he made his choice. Along with his most senior surviving officers, he turned his own sword against himself, falling upon the blade to deny the enemy their prize. His suicide was the final, symbolic death of Roman authority in Germania. With their leaders gone, the last organized resistance collapsed completely. The few remaining soldiers were hunted down among the gorse and bracken of the hill. Some fought to the last breath, others were cut down as they ran. The non-combatants who had survived the long nightmare met a similar fate or were rounded up as spoils of war, destined for a life of slavery. By nightfall on that third day, a profound and eerie silence had returned to the Teutoburg Forest. The 17th, 18th, and 19th legions of Rome had ceased to exist. Not a single organized unit escaped. Of nearly 20,000 people, only a handful of scattered fugitives would ever reach the Rhine to tell the tale. The pride of Augustus had been wiped from the earth, leaving behind a field of broken armor, shattered bones, and a mystery that would haunt an empire for centuries. The silence that fell over the Teutoburg Forest did not last long. Word of the catastrophe traveled with the speed of a lightning strike, carried by the few survivors who stumbled, half dead and wild-eyed, through the marshes to the Roman forts on the Rhine. Their stories were so unbelievable, so horrific, that the frontier commanders at first refused to accept them. 3 entire legions gone. It was a logistical impossibility, a nightmare that defied all reason. Yet as more ragged fugitives appeared, and as the scouting parties sent eastward returned with tales of a landscape littered with bones and rusting armor, the terrible truth solidified into a cold, hard fact. A courier ship was dispatched down the Rhine, across the Mediterranean, and to the heart of the empire itself, carrying news that would shatter the age of Augustus. When the report finally reached Rome, it detonated like a bomb in the Forum. The city, accustomed to bulletins of victory and expansion, was utterly unprepared for a defeat of this magnitude. Panic spread through the streets faster than any fire. Rumors swirled that the Germanic hordes, drunk on victory, were already massing to cross the Rhine, that they would sweep into Gaul and then descend upon Italy itself. The unthinkable was suddenly plausible. The Roman people, who had known only growing power for a generation, now confronted the visceral fear of invasion, the same fear their ancestors had felt when the Gauls sacked the city centuries before. Emperor Augustus, the architect of this peace and prosperity, was said to have been broken by the news. The historian Suetonius records that for months afterward, the emperor would let his hair and beard grow wild as a sign of mourning. He would sometimes pound his head against the palace doors, shouting into the emptiness, "Quintili ver, legions red, Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." It was more than a cry of grief. It was the agonized scream of a statesman who saw the cornerstone of his life's work crumbling before his eyes. The military response was one of sheer, desperate triage. The Rhine frontier, now terrifyingly vulnerable, had to be reinforced at any cost. Legions were stripped from other peaceful provinces, from Spain, from Illyricum, from the Balkans, and rushed north in a frantic shuffling of empire's limited military resources. It left other borders dangerously thin, a gamble taken to prevent total collapse in the north. The grand strategy of expansion was dead, replaced overnight by a policy of pure defense. The dream of a province of Germania stretching to the Elbe River was abandoned, its maps rolled up and stored away as bitter monuments to hubris. The Rhine River was no longer a stepping stone. It became a fortified moat, the permanent, hardened border of the Roman world. Every bridgehead east of the river was systematically evacuated and destroyed. The legions built walls, watchtowers, and deep ditches, facing east in a perpetual, watchful stance. The psychological impact was even deeper than the military one. For the first time in living memory, Rome had been dealt a blow from which it would not recover territory. The myth of eternal, inevitable expansion was punctured. The legions were not invincible. The barbarian could win. This loss introduced a note of profound insecurity into the Roman psyche, a crack in the marble facade of imperial confidence that would never fully be repaired. And somewhere beyond that fortified river, in the dark forests they now feared to enter, the victors were performing a final, grisly ritual of triumph. The shock of Teutoburg demanded a response, and Rome's answer came in the form of a young, vengeful prince. A few years after the disaster, with the Rhine frontier stabilized but the wound still raw, command fell to Germanicus Julius Caesar, the adopted son and nephew of the new emperor Tiberius. He was not an administrator like Varus. He was a soldier's soldier, charismatic, aggressive, and burning with a desire to restore Roman honor. His mission was not to reconquer Germania, but to punish it, to deliver a lesson in terror so profound it would cauterize the shame of the lost legions. He launched a series of massive punitive expeditions, the largest Roman military operations ever seen north of the Alps. Crossing the Rhine with 8 legions and a vast fleet, he sought out Arminius' coalition not for a single battle, but for a war of annihilation. The campaigns were brutal and effective. Germanicus' legions marched deep into the heartland of the Cherusci, burning villages, destroying crops, and slaughtering any warriors who dared stand against them in open battle. In a major engagement at the Weser River, Roman discipline finally met Germanic fury on a field of its own choosing, and this time the legions prevailed. Arminius himself was wounded and barely escaped, his coalition of tribes shattered by the relentless Roman advance. The symbolic climax of Germanicus' campaign came when he deliberately marched his army toward the Teutoburg Forest. His scouts led them to the very site of the Varus disaster. What they found there was not a battlefield but a haunted grove. The forest had partially reclaimed the scene, but the evidence of the massacre was everywhere. The ground was littered with the bleached and scattered bones of thousands, lying where they had fallen years before. Skulls, grim trophies of the Germanic victory, were still nailed to the trunks of oak trees, staring blankly through empty sockets. The remnants of the last desperate Roman camp were visible, a low earthen rampart now smoothed by rain and time. For the hardened legionaries of Germanicus' army, this was a moment of profound and chilling reckoning. These were not anonymous bones. They were the remains of the 17th, the 18th, the 19th. They were uncles, brothers, and fathers of men now serving in other legions. With solemn reverence, Germanicus ordered his men to lay their comrades to rest. They gathered the skeletal remains from the mud and the thickets, piling them into great funeral pyres or burying them in mass graves with full military honors. It was a cathartic ritual for the entire Roman world, a belated funeral for the lost, and a defiant reclamation of sacred ground. Yet even in this act of closure, there was a terrible admission. They could bury the dead, but they could not hold the land. Germanicus' campaigns, for all their ferocity, were a magnificent raid, not a reconquest. After paying his respects to the ghosts of the Teutoburg, he gave the order to withdraw back across the Rhine. The forest had been avenged, but it would never be tamed. The ghosts of the Teutoburg Forest faded into legend, and with them the precise location of the battle vanished. For nearly 2,000 years, the exact spot where Rome's 3 legions met their end was one of history's great geographical mysteries. Ancient historians like Tacitus mentioned the Saltus Teutoburgensis, the Teutoburg Forest, but that was a vast, imprecise name for a sprawling wilderness covering much of what is now northern Germany. Without a surviving map or a clear set of Roman mile markers, the battlefield's location dissolved into scholarly debate and local folklore. Was it near the town of Detmold, beneath the dramatic statue of Hermann the German, a 19th-century monument to Arminius, or was it further north near the city of Osnabrück? For centuries, historians and amateur sleuths pored over the vague Latin texts, trying to match descriptions of hills, bogs, and long marches to the modern landscape. The challenge was immense. The forest terrain itself had changed over 2 millennia, with farming, development, and forestry altering the ancient paths. The Romans gave no GPS coordinates, only clues like a long march on narrow tracks between a hill and a great bog. That description could fit 100 different places in Lower Saxony. Furthermore, any tangible evidence left behind the bronze helmets, the iron spearheads, the silver coins from the legionaries' pay had been scattered to the winds. Over the centuries, local farmers plowing their fields would occasionally turn up a strange, corroded artifact. These finds were often melted down for their metal, sold to collectors, or simply tossed aside, their context and story forever lost. Without a concentrated trove of artifacts, the battlefield remained a phantom, a story without a stage. It was as if the forest, having swallowed an army, had also swallowed the memory of where it happened. This deep historical silence set the stage for one of the 20th century's most incredible archaeological detective stories, a quest to turn legend into tangible, touchable history. The search for the lost battlefield might have remained a scholarly puzzle forever, if not for a man with a simple hobby and a very good metal detector. In the late 1980s, a British Army officer named Major Tony Clun was stationed in West Germany with the Royal Artillery. He was an amateur archaeologist fascinated by Roman history, and he spent his weekends exploring the countryside around the city of Osnabrück with permission from local landowners. Unlike the academics debating texts in libraries, Clun took a hands-on physical approach. His tool of choice was a state-of-the-art metal detector, a device that could listen to the whispers of the soil. He wasn't looking for the battle of the Teutoburg Forest specifically. He was just systematically scanning plowed fields, hoping to find traces of any Roman activity in a region history said they had abandoned. For months, his efforts yielded the usual scatter of modern junk bottle caps, bits of farm machinery, nails. Then, on a cool afternoon in 1987, his detector gave a sharp, clear signal. He knelt, carefully brushed away the dark earth, and saw a small, circular glint of metal. It was a silver Roman denarius, a coin minted during the reign of Emperor Augustus. His heart must have raced. A single coin could be a loss, a stray dropped by a traveler, but he kept scanning, another signal and another. Soon he had a handful of silver denarii, all dating to the right period. This was no accident. This was a scatter pattern, the kind left by a group of people in distress or a hurried movement. Then he found the true smoking gun. His detector buzzed over a different signal, and from the dirt he recovered not silver but 3 small, almond-shaped lumps of lead. They were Roman sling bullets or glands. Each was carefully cast with a precise weight and shape, ammunition for the specialized slingers who accompanied the legions. Finding a coin was one thing. Finding military ammunition was another. A single sling bullet might be a curiosity, but 3, found alongside a cluster of coins from the exact right era, pointed unequivocally to a Roman military presence. And not just a small patrol, the density of finds suggested something much larger. Tony Clun, the amateur with a detector, had just found the first tangible, physical evidence that a major Roman army had passed through those fields near Kalkriese. The legend now had a precise postcode, and the ground beneath his feet was ready to give up its secrets. The silver coins told a story the soil could not. As the archaeological team expanded their dig around Kalkriese, they didn't just find a few stray denarii. They uncovered a veritable fortune, hundreds upon hundreds of silver coins, all scattered across the same concentrated area. This was no ordinary hoard or a merchant's lost purse. This was a rain of money, as if 1,000 pockets had been torn open at once. But the real revelation came not from the quantity, but from the dates stamped on each tiny piece of silver. The team's numismatists, the experts in ancient currency, carefully catalogued every coin. They sorted them by emperor, by mint, by design, and they noticed something startling, a pattern so clear it felt like a message from the past. Every single coin they recovered had been minted during the reign of Augustus, and not a single one bore a date later than 9 AD. Think of that for a moment. In a site littered with military debris, you would expect to find coins from many eras if it were a long-term camp or a trading post. You might find older coins from earlier reigns, and crucially, you would almost certainly find newer coins dropped by later visitors or garrisons. But here, the coinage stopped dead. It was as if a clock had been frozen at the very moment of disaster. In archaeology, this is called a terminus post quem, a Latin phrase meaning the date after which. It provides the earliest possible date a layer of soil was deposited or an event occurred. At Kalkriese, the terminus post quem was 9 AD. The site saw intense activity right up to that year, and then, abruptly, nothing. No later Roman coins, no later Roman artifacts of any kind. The ground held a perfect, silent timestamp that matched the historical record of the Varus disaster with chilling precision. This numismatic evidence transformed the investigation. Before the coins, Kalkriese was an interesting site with some Roman military finds. After the coins, it became the prime candidate for one of history's greatest lost battlefields. The money didn't just prove Romans were there, it proved they were there at the exact right moment in history, and then they were gone forever. The ground at Kalkriese began to tell its story in whispers of metal and fragments of bone. Following Tony Clun's initial discovery, a full-scale archaeological excavation began, a meticulous grid-by-grid dissection of the landscape that continues to this very day. What they uncovered was not a clean, organized battlefield, but a sprawling crime scene frozen in time, a horrifically detailed snapshot of an army's final moments. The first layer of soil gave up the small, scattered items, the coins and sling bullets. But as the archaeologists dug deeper, brushing away centuries of peat and silt, they reached the main event layer, a dark, compacted stratum of earth stained with the iron oxide of rusted metal, and chillingly with high concentrations of phosphate from decomposed organic matter from bodies. Here, the forest floor had preserved a nightmare. The human remains told the most visceral story. These were not complete skeletons laid out in graves, but scattered, fragmented bones often found in isolated clusters. A skull would appear, its dome cleft clean through by a single, terrible blow from a Germanic axe. A rib cage, partially articulated, would reveal the snapped-off iron tip of a spear or a javelin still wedged between the bones. The injuries were overwhelmingly to the front and left side of the body, the side a right-handed soldier would present as he raised his shield. This indicated the Romans were fighting in some semblance of formation when they were cut down, but the sheer force and close-quarters nature of the attacks were gruesomely clear. There were few wounds to the back, not because they weren't running, but because those who turned to flee likely made it only a few steps before being struck down from behind. Mixed in with the human bones were those of animals, the butchered remains of mules and oxen from the baggage train. Their bones showed precise butchering marks from Roman knives, evidence of the soldiers' desperate, last-ditch attempts to salvage food as their own supplies were plundered or lost in the mud. And everywhere there was metal. The soil yielded a corroded tapestry of Roman military life violently interrupted. They found the heavy iron nails from military sandals, the Kalkriese, littering the ground like confetti from a disintegrating line of march. There were fragments of the iconic segmented plate armor, the lorica segmentata, its delicate bronze hinges and leather ties long rotted away, leaving behind curved plates bent and smashed by crushing blows. They recovered the brass fittings from belts and sword scabbards, the bronze handles of cooking pots, and the iron heads of pilum, the Roman javelin, many with their soft metal shanks bent from impact, designed so they could not be thrown back. One of the most haunting finds was a fragment of a silver-plated Roman cavalry mask, a ceremonial piece worn during tournaments or parades. It was not found on a body, but crumpled and discarded, a piece of parade ground vanity utterly out of place in this muddy charnel house. Each artifact, from a massive axe head to a tiny silver earring from a camp follower, was mapped with laser precision, its location telling the archaeologists not just what happened, but where and how the battle unfolded across the landscape. The scatter patterns revealed kill zones, areas of last stand, and the paths of the panicked rout. The field of bones and rust was slowly, painstakingly, being translated back into a narrative of chaos, courage, and utter destruction. This was no longer just a site, it was an open grave, and every trowel of dirt removed was an act of forensic recovery, piecing together the final hours of the 17th, 18th, and 19th. But perhaps the single most stunning discovery at Kalkriese was not something the Romans left behind, but something built to receive them. As archaeologists extended their trenches along the base of the ridge, they uncovered a structure that transformed our understanding of the event entirely. Running for nearly a kilometer along the northern slope of the Kalkriese hill was a massive man-made rampart. This was no natural feature. It was a Germanic-built fortification, a wall of death constructed specifically for this battle. It was built with shocking sophistication. The core was a thick, sturdy wall made of stacked turfs, rectangular blocks of earth cut from the surrounding meadow, their grass roots knitting the structure together. This earthen core was then reinforced with a palisade of sharpened wooden posts driven deep into the ground, creating a formidable barrier. On the side facing the expected Roman approach, the wall rose to a height of perhaps 6 or 7 feet. But on the reverse side, the side where the Germanic warriors would wait, the ground was built up into a gentle slope like a viewing platform or a stage. This architectural detail is chilling in its purpose. It meant the warriors could stand comfortably on their own rampart, looking down over the top, with a clear line of sight and a stable platform from which to throw spears or shoot arrows. This wall was the masterstroke of Arminius's plan. It proved beyond any doubt that the ambush was not a lucky attack by a scattered band of tribesmen. This was a pre-planned, meticulously engineered killing zone, constructed weeks or even months in advance. The geography itself was the weapon. The wall ran along the ridge, and to its immediate south lay an immense, impassable bog. The only viable path for the exhausted Roman column was a strip of dry land no more than 100 meters wide, squeezed between this man-made wall and the natural trap of the swamp. The legions were not just ambushed, they were funneled like cattle in a slaughterhouse chute into a narrow corridor of death. As the head of the column trudged past this hidden fortification, the wall suddenly came alive. Thousands of warriors rose from behind its crest, unleashing a concentrated, point-blank barrage of javelins, stones, and arrows down onto the trapped Romans below. There was no room to maneuver, no way to form a defensive line against an enemy standing above them on a wall. The front of the column was pinned and massacred, causing a catastrophic traffic jam that compressed the entire army into a helpless, panicking mass. The rear, hearing the screams but unable to see or help, would have pushed forward into the chaos, making the kill zone even more dense and target-rich. This wall is the ultimate testament to Arminius' genius. He used Roman military engineering against them, creating a fixed defensive position not to defend a piece of land, but to annihilate an army on the move. Every turf block laid, every post hammered into the earth, was a silent promise of the vengeance to come. The discovery of this rampart didn't just confirm the location of the battle, it revealed the cold, calculating intellect behind the bloodshed, turning a legendary ambush into a historically documented massacre of industrial efficiency. The most intimate whispers of the disaster came not from the weapons, but from the personal possessions scattered in the mud. Among the shattered armor and mass graves, archaeologists began to uncover the small, heartbreaking items that had belonged to individual people, turning statistics back into human beings. A fine silver-plated cavalry mask, crumpled and lost, speaks of an officer who brought a piece of parade ground splendor to the frontier, a man who valued appearance and status even in a wild land. Nearby, they found a surgeon's kit, a collection of bronze and iron instruments including a delicate probe and a scalpel, the tools of a man whose duty was to heal, not to kill, overwhelmed by a tide of injuries he could never hope to mend. In another corner of the field, a simple gaming die carved from bone tumbled from a pouch. It is a universal object, a fragment of downtime, of bored soldiers huddled around a cloak, gambling their meager pay and sharing laughter that would soon be silenced. A delicate bronze fibula, a brooch used to fasten a cloak, tells of someone who cared for their dress, perhaps a civilian trader or an officer's wife traveling with the column. And perhaps most haunting of all are the finds that speak of captivity before the end, heavy iron shackles, a prisoner's chain. This reveals that the marching column included enslaved people, individuals already stripped of freedom, caught in a catastrophe that offered no deliverance. Each of these objects is a frozen moment. The surgeon's probe was last held by a hand trying to save a life. The die was last thrown in hope of a lucky roll. The brooch last fastened a garment against the chill autumn rain. Together, they perform a quiet archaeology of the ordinary, reconstructing not a battle but a community on the move. They remind us that the three legions were not a faceless military machine. They were 20,000 individual souls, the proud cavalryman, the skilled doctor, the young recruit from Italy missing home, the craftsman, the servant, the enslaved person. Each had a name, a story, and a hope for the future that ended abruptly on that muddy corridor between the wall and the bog. These small, silent witnesses force us to confront the true scale of the tragedy, not as the loss of legions with numbers, but as the obliteration of a whole world of human experience. For a Roman legion, its eagle was not merely a flag. It was the living embodiment of its spirit, its honor, and its sacred bond with the gods of Rome. Cast in silver or gold with outstretched wings, the aquila was the legion's most precious possession, guarded day and night by the aquilifer, the standard-bearer, a soldier chosen for his immense strength and unwavering courage. To lose this standard in battle was the ultimate, unthinkable catastrophe. It meant the legion's divine favor had been withdrawn. It was a spiritual death that preceded the physical destruction of its men. In the choking mud of the Teutoburg Forest, this ultimate disgrace was not suffered once but 3 times over. As the 17th, 18th, and 19th legions were torn apart, their sacred eagles were wrenched from the hands of their dying bearers. We can picture the final, desperate struggles around those standards, a shrinking circle of legionaries fighting not for ground, but for the soul of their unit until the last man fell and the gleaming eagle was carried off into the Germanic gloom as the ultimate war trophy. Their physical loss was a wound to the empire's pride, but their symbolic loss was a poison in the Roman psyche. Those 3 missing eagles were a constant, haunting reminder of the defeat. They were not just lost metal, they were lost honor paraded by Germanic tribes as proof that the gods could abandon Rome. This created an obsession that would shape Roman policy for a generation. Every subsequent campaign across the Rhine under commanders like Germanicus carried a dual purpose. Yes, they sought to punish the tribes and secure the frontier. But burning beneath that strategic goal was a sacred, almost mythical quest to find and reclaim the lost eagles. It was a mission of redemption. To bring an eagle home was to heal a part of the empire's soul, to restore a fragment of divine order that had been shattered in that forest. The recovery of even one would be a propaganda triumph, a sign that the gods had forgiven Rome and restored their favor. This quest turned military expeditions into spiritual rescue missions. Soldiers scoured captured villages and sacred groves, interrogated prisoners, and followed every rumor, hoping for a glimpse of silver wings. The pressure on a Roman general to return an eagle was immense, for it would cement his legacy as a true restorer of Roman dignitas. The ghosts of Varus's legions would not rest, and Rome could not truly move on until those silent, captured gods were brought back to their temples. The ultimate testament to Rome's shame was not just the loss of men, but the erasure of their very identity. In the wake of the Teutoburg disaster, the Roman military performed a unique and chilling act of institutional forgetting. The numbers 17, 18, and 19 were permanently retired. No new legions would ever bear those numerals again. It was as if the 3 units had not just been defeated, but had been voided from existence, their honors and their history stricken from the record. This went far beyond a simple administrative decision. It was a form of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, a practice Romans typically reserved for traitors or disgraced emperors. Statues would be torn down, names chiseled off inscriptions, and all official records purged to erase a person from public memory. To apply this practice to entire legions was unprecedented. These were not just military formations, they were ancient institutions, some over a century old, with battle honors stretching back to the days of Julius Caesar. Yet their association with the Varus disaster was so toxic, so utterly catastrophic to Roman prestige, that the state chose to treat them as if they had never been. Imagine the profound stigma. In barracks and veterans' colonies across the empire, soldiers of other legions would speak in hushed tones about the lost ones. To have served in the 17th, 18th, or 19th was now a mark of supreme disgrace, even for the pitiful few survivors. Their legacy was not one of heroic last stands, but of a shame so deep the empire tried to bury it with the bodies. This act of erasure tells us more about the psychological wound than any battle description. Rome could rebuild its armies, it could fortify its borders, but it could not rehabilitate these numbers. They became ghost numbers haunting the Roman military list, a permanent, silent scar on the legionary roll call, and a forever reminder of the day the forest won. Arminius stood atop a broken world of his own making. His victory in the Teutoburg Forest was the pinnacle of his life, a masterstroke that shattered Roman power east of the Rhine. Yet the man who could orchestrate the perfect ambush could not build a perfect peace. In the years that followed, the very forces that made his victory possible, the fierce independence and ancient rivalries of the Germanic tribes, now conspired to tear his legacy apart. He had united them against a common enemy, but once that enemy receded behind its fortified river, the old jealousies and power struggles resurfaced with a vengeance. Arminius found himself fighting not Romans but former allies in a brutal civil war for supremacy among the tribes. He won battles, but he could not win hearts. His ambition to become a king of the Germans, a permanent ruler, was seen by many chieftains as a betrayal of the very freedom he had championed. He had exchanged a distant Roman master for a demanding Cheruscan one. This tension culminated in the ultimate betrayal. Around the year 21 AD, after more than a decade of intertribal warfare, Arminius was assassinated. His killers were not Roman agents, but his own kinsmen, members of his family and tribe who saw his growing power as a threat. The liberator died, as so many revolutionary leaders do, not at the hands of the foreign oppressor, but by the knives of those he sought to lead. His dream of a united Germanic nation died with him in the forest, and the tribes returned to their fragmented ways, their moment of unity lost to history. For centuries, Arminius himself was almost lost to history. Roman historians like Tacitus recorded him with a grudging respect, calling him the liberator of Germany, but his story was preserved in Latin texts, not Germanic sagas. As Rome faded and Europe moved into the Middle Ages, the memory of the Cheruscan prince faded into an obscure footnote, a curious tale from the distant past with little relevance to the patchwork of German duchies and kingdoms. He was a ghost without a monument, a name without a nation to claim him. That all changed with the slow simmer of German nationalism. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as German-speaking peoples looked across their divided map of petty states and principalities, they began to search for a founding hero, a figure who could symbolize a shared identity and a defiant spirit against external domination. They found him, or rather, they resurrected him. Scholars rediscovered the Roman accounts and transformed Arminius from a historical actor into a national myth. They gave him a German name, Hermann the Cheruscan. He was no longer a complex, flawed chieftain who won a battle and died in a feud. He was reimagined as the primordial German, the first patriot, the man who defined Germany by defending it against a foreign empire. This symbolic rebirth reached its stone and bronze climax in the 19th century. As the movement for German unification grew, so did the monuments to Hermann. The most colossal of these is the Hermanndenkmal, the Hermann Monument, which towers over the Teutoburg Forest near Detmold. Construction began in 1838 and was not completed until 1875, a timeline that mirrors the long, difficult struggle to forge a single German nation. The statue itself is a figure of Wagnerian grandeur. Hermann stands over 170 feet tall on a massive stone pedestal, his mighty sword raised triumphantly toward the sky, his gaze fixed westward, forever guarding the German woods from the Roman foe. He is clad in idealized ancient Germanic dress, a winged helmet on his head, a figure of pure mythic power. His foot rests defiantly on a Roman eagle standard, a visual stamp of eternal victory. This monument was not built for archaeologists, it was built for a people. It served as a powerful physical anchor for a national story, a declaration that the German spirit was born in resistance, forged in the forest, and destined for unity. When the German Empire was finally proclaimed in 1871, Hermann was there in spirit, his stone likeness now representing a prophecy fulfilled. The man betrayed by his kin had become the immortal father of a nation, his true history buried beneath the weight of the symbol he was forced to bear. The story of the Teutoburg Forest is no longer confined to ancient texts or scattered artifacts. It lives, breathes, and continues to be rewritten at the very place where it happened. Today, the quiet fields of Kalkriese are home to a stunning, state-of-the-art museum and archaeological park, a place where the past is not just displayed but actively interrogated. The Museum und Park Kalkriese is a masterclass in public history, built directly over a portion of the excavated battlefield. Its most striking feature is a soaring, rust-colored observation tower, a modern sentinel watching over the ancient landscape. Inside, the exhibits do not simply show you objects behind glass. They immerse you in the evidence. You walk alongside a ghostly, life-sized silhouette of the Germanic rampart, its turf blocks and wooden posts reconstructed to exact archaeological specifications. You see the actual scatter of coins, sling bullets, and human bone fragments, each piece meticulously mapped to show the density of the carnage. The museum's genius is in its presentation of forensic science as detective story, allowing you to follow the same clues that led to the site's identification, making you a participant in the discovery. But the museum is not a tomb sealing a finished story. It is the headquarters for an investigation that is very much alive. Every year, when the weather permits, archaeologists return to the soil. Their tools have evolved far beyond the trowel and brush, though those are still essential. Now they employ ground-penetrating radar and magnetometry, technologies that allow them to see shapes and disturbances beneath the surface without ever breaking ground. These electronic eyes scan the surrounding farmlands, searching for the telltale signatures of ditches, pits, or mass graves that have eluded discovery for 2 millennia. Soil core sampling analyzes the very chemistry of the earth, looking for spikes in phosphate or traces of metals that could mark the location of a temporary Roman night camp or a previously unknown pocket of the main battle. The current focus is on expanding the excavation area, moving beyond the central kill zone to understand the full, horrifying scale of the 3-day engagement. Where exactly did the Romans make their first desperate stand on that second night? Where did the final, fragmented remnants of the legions make their last hopeless charge? These questions drive the research forward. This means that the history of the Varus disaster is still being written, one careful scrape of the soil at a time. Each summer digging season holds the potential for a revelation that could shift our understanding of the event. A new cluster of shackles could tell us more about the captives. A concentration of arrowheads might pinpoint a previously unknown ambush point. The discovery of a single, stylized piece of officer's equipment could even hint at the exact spot where Varus himself fell. The work at Kalkriese is a powerful reminder that some stories are never truly finished. The forest gave up its greatest secret only a few decades ago, and it may yet have more to tell. The lost legions have been found, but their final hours are still whispering from the ground, waiting for the right tool, the right scan, the right pair of careful hands to listen. Yet for all the certainty the rampart and the coins provide, the Teutoburg Forest has not surrendered all of its secrets. Kalkriese is overwhelmingly accepted as the site of the final, catastrophic ambush, the 3rd day's slaughter. But the battle raged for 3 days across many miles. This leaves a haunting trail of unanswered questions that keep historians and archaeologists awake at night. The first major debate revolves around the other 2 days of the massacre. If the final stand was at Kalkriese, where were the earlier engagements? Some scholars argue the initial ambush must have occurred dozens of miles to the east, near modern-day Minden or Detmold, where the terrain also matches the ancient descriptions of narrow passes between hills and bogs. These alternative proposed sites are not necessarily rivals to Kalkriese, but potential pieces of the same gruesome puzzle, different chapters in the 3-day death march. Without a continuous trail of artifacts linking them, however, they remain compelling theories on a map, not proven facts in the ground. This leads to the most profound physical mystery. We have found scattered bones and small, poignant clusters of remains at Kalkriese, but where is the primary burial site? Where are the thousands? After the battle, Germanicus's men reported building massive funeral pyres. The sheer scale of the cleanup suggests the Romans interred or burned the dead in several large, concentrated areas. Finding even one of these main necropolises would be an archaeological discovery of staggering magnitude. It would offer an unparalleled biological snapshot of a Roman army, revealing their ages, their health, their origins, and the specific, brutal ways they died. But these mass graves have eluded detection. Perhaps they lie under modern towns or deep within reclaimed farmland, their location lost when the memory of the battlefield itself faded away. They are the silent, hidden heart of the disaster. Then there are the questions of individuals. We can walk the kill zone at Kalkriese, but where exactly did Publius Quinctilius Varus take his own life? Did he fall near the eagle of his beloved 17th Legion? Or was he in a more secluded spot with his senior staff? Finding his remains, identified by the insignia of a governor, is the ultimate historical long shot, but it symbolizes our desire to pin down the precise moment Roman authority evaporated. Similarly, what was the legion's exact line of march? Piecing together their tortuous route from the summer camp to the forest ambush is like trying to reconstruct a path through a maze that no longer exists. Every twisted trail and sunken bog they struggled through holds part of the story of their disorientation and despair. And finally, what of the survivors? The ancient sources are clear that the army was annihilated, but annihilation is rarely 100% absolute. Could small, scattered bands of legionaries have escaped the slaughter, fleeing into the trackless woods? If so, their fate is a dark fairy tale. Some may have perished from exposure or been hunted down, but others, perhaps, were captured and eventually integrated into Germanic society. A Roman blacksmith or carpenter would have been a valuable asset to a tribe. Is it possible that somewhere in the genetic or cultural memory of the region, there echoes a faint trace of those lost legions, not in monuments, but in family stories so old their origin has been forgotten? These questions, from the logistical to the human, ensure the story of the lost legions is never truly closed. The battlefield has been found, but its deepest shadows still hold their secrets, inviting us to keep looking, to keep wondering what else the silent ground might finally decide to say. The legacy of those 3 lost legions stretches far beyond the borders of an archaeological site. It has echoed through centuries, a story so powerful it refused to stay buried in the history books. In the world of art and literature, the Teutoburg Forest became a dramatic stage for exploring timeless themes. 19th century German playwrights and poets seized upon the figure of Arminius or Hermann, turning him into a romantic hero of freedom, a symbol of national destiny rising from the misty woods. In more modern times, the battle has been the subject of best-selling historical novels, gripping television documentaries, and even major feature films. These retellings often focus on the personal drama, the clash of cultures between the disciplined Roman Varus and the vengeful, freedom-fighting Arminius. They visualize the claustrophobic terror of the forest ambush, making the ancient horror visceral for a new audience. Each adaptation, whether on page or screen, asks the same compelling question: what does it mean to resist an empire, and what price does victory demand? But the cultural memory is only one layer of this legacy. The strategic impact of the battle was absolute and permanent. The Rhine River became Rome's fixed, fortified northern frontier. All ambitions of conquering Germania up to the Elbe River were abandoned forever. This single military disaster didn't just change a border, it altered the course of European history. By halting Roman expansion here, the battle ensured that the lands east of the Rhine developed along a distinctly Germanic cultural and linguistic path, separate from the Latinized world of Gaul, Spain, and Italy. The modern linguistic map of Europe, with the division between Germanic and Romance languages, was profoundly shaped by the outcome of those 3 days in 9 AD. In many ways, the line drawn by Augustus's grief became a civilizational fault line. On a symbolic level, the story of the Teutoburg Forest possesses a raw, universal power. It is the ultimate underdog narrative, a coalition of disparate tribes viewed as primitive barbarians by a glittering superpower, outsmarts and annihilates the world's greatest military machine. This template of the cunning local defeating the arrogant invader has inspired countless resistance movements and national myths across the globe, yet it also serves as a chilling, eternal cautionary tale. It is a masterclass in the dangers of imperial overreach, of misunderstanding the people you seek to rule. Varus failed because he saw Germania as a province to be administered, not as a living, breathing culture with its own fierce pride. He ignored local warnings, trusted the wrong insider, and marched his army into a terrain that neutralized all its strengths. His story is a warning about the hubris of power, the blindness that comes from believing your own civilization's superiority is inevitable. It asks us what happens when an empire stops listening, when it values order over understanding, and when it forgets that even the quietest forest can hide a storm. The Lost Legions of Varus teach us that history is not just about the battles that were won, but about the limits that were found and the stories we choose to remember about why. That single, catastrophic defeat echoed for centuries, its consequences far outlasting the screams that faded in the forest. The loss of Varus's legions was more than a military defeat. It was a pivotal moment that changed the course of European history. Think of the Roman Empire at its peak, a civilization that seemed destined to absorb everything it touched. Its legions were the unstoppable force of the ancient world. Yet, in the muddy tracks of the Teutoburg Forest, that force met an immovable object, not of stone, but of will, terrain, and cunning strategy. That collision did not just stop 3 legions, it stopped an entire imperial project. The dream of a Roman province stretching to the Elbe River died with Varus. The Rhine became a permanent wall, a fortified border that divided the continent. This meant the cultures on either side of that river developed along profoundly different paths. West of the Rhine, the lands of Gaul became Latinized, their languages evolving into modern French, Spanish, and Italian. East of the Rhine, the Germanic tribes retained their languages and traditions, laying the foundation for a different Europe. The battle, in a very real sense, helped draw the map we recognize today. From the treacherous forests of Germania to the shocked halls of Rome, and finally to the quiet fields of Kalkriese where archaeologists piece together the past, this mystery reminds us that history is written not just by victors but also by the lost. For centuries, the only story was the Roman one, a tale of tragic hubris and barbarian treachery. But the silent witnesses in the soil, the coins, the bones, the wall, they gave a voice back to the vanquished. They allowed the forest itself to testify. We now see the battle not as a simple ambush, but as a complex, brilliantly executed act of resistance by a people fighting for their way of life. It forces us to listen to the other side of the story, to understand that history is a mosaic, and sometimes the most important pieces are the ones that went missing for 2,000 years. So we are left with the echoes and the questions. What do you think happened to the lost eagles? Were they melted down into trophies, buried in sacred groves, or perhaps hidden away, waiting for another Tony Clun with a metal detector to find them? And on a grander scale, could Rome have conquered Germania without this disaster? Was the forest simply too vast, the tribes too independent for Roman rule to ever truly take root? Or did this single event alter destiny itself? The ground at Kalkriese is still speaking. Share your theories below, and if you love unraveling historical mysteries where one discovery can rewrite everything we thought we knew, subscribe for more deep dives into the past.